I think the era of plant-based drugs um, may be sort of in its twilight years. The market is moving from plant-based to synthetic. Someone may find a way to manufacture cocaine synthetically that doesn't involve the coca plant at all. And if someone figures out a way to do that, and it probably won't be a university, it'll probably be an organized crime group. If they find out a way to produce cheaply, in the same way that we produce MDMA or these other synthetic drugs, to produce cocaine synthetically, the entire cocaine supply chain changes overnight. So there will the coca plant and production in Latin America or elsewhere in Central America just stops literally overnight. That entire market collapses. Hi, my name's Steve Rolls, and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, which is a UK-based NGO, non-government organisation, that's been working in the field of drug policy reform and advocacy for the past 25 years. And a focus of our work has been critiquing the failings of the war on drugs and looking for alternative approaches that can deliver a truly just and effective drug policy, including the decriminalisation of personal private drug use and models for the legal regulation of all drugs. When someone says the word coca, I actually do think of the coca plant. I've been fortunate enough to visit Colombia, and I've visited indigenous communities and seen them growing coca in a traditional way in their villages and using it in a traditional way. So I'm lucky, I think, for someone from the UK to have a more authentic perspective about what coca is and what the word coca means, and the plant as it was originally used historically, separated from the wider debates around cocaine, for example. Cocaine, coca, and crack cocaine are, or bazuco or pasta base, as it's variously called in different parts of Latin America. They all contain the same alkaloid, essentially, but they are incredibly different in terms of how they're used, the effects that they produce, and the risks and social contexts in which those using behaviors take place. So, coca leaf has a very small percentage of cocaine alkaloid in it. It's less than 1% actual cocaine alkaloid. So when it's used in traditional context, when it's chewed, it does provide a psychoactive effect. I mean, it is a drug, but it's a very mild drug and it has a very slow onset, compared to cocaine powder, which is the cocaine alkaloid extracted from the coca leaf and concentrated, so it's effectively 100% pure alkaloid. That's usually then snorted. Sometimes it's used in the mouth, or occasionally it's injected. But obviously you have a similar effect, but it's hugely concentrated. Rather than playing out over maybe half an hour, or 2 hours, which you would get with chewed coca leaf, you have a much bigger dose and you receive it much more rapidly. And again, with crack cocaine, when you smoke it, it's the same thing again, but concentrated even further. And so you have a huge rush, very intense, but it's very short-lived. It only lasts for about 5 minutes. So it's really interesting that you have the same drug, but the different preparations are associated with enormously different behaviors, enormously different social and cultural contexts, and enormously different spectrum of risks, from effectively no risk at all associated with traditional coca leaf chewing, and nominally it's a number of health benefits, through to crack cocaine or injected cocaine, which can be profoundly risky and highly addictive and can cause serious problems, and then everything in between as well. So it's an unusual drug in that respect. If you compared it to something like ecstasy, MDMA, you either have that in a pill or a powder and you take it and it has a very defined effect. But cocaine powder and crack cocaine, even though technically they are the same alkaloid molecule, or they contain the same alkaloid molecule, they're enormously different in their effects, their risks, and their cultural contexts. certainly think that coca leaf does not have the same cultural associations that cocaine powder has, because cocaine powder, going back to the 60s and 70s, when it became a particularly in that period, it became a popular drug in the global north, predominantly amongst more affluent, privileged communities, but partly because it was very expensive. It's been associated with a lot of culture, with the sort of champagne party lifestyle, but also with kind of gangsterism, kind of Miami Vice and Scarface, and there's an awful lot of kind of popular culture that looks at cocaine as a vice, and it's been quite demonized, particularly from the 80s onwards in North America, where crack cocaine started to become more popular. And that was very much associated with violence and deviance, and was very much associated with a lot of racist narratives. The culture around cocaine, and particularly around crack, the cultural narratives, I think, have been very negative. Whereas coca leaf, I mean, it has a far lower profile in global popular culture, because American culture has been very much focused on cocaine and crack cocaine. And American culture permeates throughout the whole world through television and Hollywood and so on. I think for most people in the global north, and for large parts of the world, is very disassociated from cocaine and crack. Most people, I think, if you asked them and did a street survey, wouldn't even maybe know what coca leaf was, or they certainly wouldn't understand the association that cocaine was extracted from it in some way. People know that cocaine comes from Colombia and Peru and Bolivia, because there are these slang terms like Bolivian marching powder, and people may be aware of traditional use and traditional chewing of coca leaf, but it doesn't have the stigma and demonization and cultural associations associated with popular culture and Hollywood culture around cocaine and crack. And that's partly because coca leaf is not a drug consumed. It's not a product that's consumed at all in the global north. I mean, I think it's in many ways, I think it's a shame. You can easily get cocaine and crack cocaine in Europe and North America, but you can't get coca leaf. It's almost impossible to get coca leaf. It's virtually never imported here. So it's not a product that's used, and it's not a product that's well understood, or a plant that's well understood in its historic context within the Andean region. Well, the origins of prohibition go back, I think, more than 100 years to the beginnings of last century. In some ways, I think this was prohibition kind of began, I think, at the kind of emergence of the modern pharmaceutical medicine era, where certain plant-based drugs, including opium and opioids, and including cocaine and cannabis, were identified by medical professionals as having a risk of non-medical use, addiction, dependence, and physical harms. So I think there was an effort by medical establishments to try and regulate these products so that they wouldn't be misused outside of medical contexts. That advocacy wasn't necessarily for prohibition in terms of the more modern contemporary war on drugs, i.e., criminalizing people who use drugs, and having policing and militarized punitive enforcement against supply. It was more kind of medical regulatory type controls. But I think over a period of time, as those drugs became more popular within for non-medical use within a broader population, control of those drugs became a tool for various forms of power to be expressed in terms of control over certain populations. And particularly, we can see that prohibition of certain drugs was used as a form of racial or class repression. So different groups were associated with different drugs. Those drugs were criminalized, and it provided an opportunity for people in power to control certain populations or communities. And a lot of this came from the US, I have to position all of this. A lot of it came from the US, that during last century was emerging and consolidating its position as a kind of global hegemonic power, both economically and politically. And in America, they wanted to, various people in power wanted to control or exploit the racial tensions. So cannabis was very much associated with immigrants from Mexico. Cocaine was very much associated with more so with African American communities. Opium was very much associated with Chinese and Asian communities. And prohibition of those drugs provided a tool for control and oppression of those groups. So I don't think all of prohibition was ill-intended. You know, some people do have legitimate concerns about drugs and drug use and drug-related health challenges, addiction and overdose and so on. And they saw prohibition and criminalizing use or criminalizing sales and enforcement against markets as a way to achieve health outcomes. And so I don't think everybody had a sinister agenda, certainly not at the very beginning, where I think it was more about medical controls, but it has mutated over time. People who threatened the establishment, they could be criminalized or they could be oppressed using drug prohibition. So it became a political tool rather than a legitimate public health response. And we know it wasn't a legitimate public health response because the outcomes have been appallingly terrible. You know, on almost any measure that you could choose, prohibition has been a failure on its own terms. You know, it hasn't reduced drug use. Drug use has risen consistently for the last 100 years. It hasn't reduced the scale of drug markets, which have also expanded to meet that rising demand. We've seen drug deaths rising year on year for decades. You know, it's been a public health disaster as a policy paradigm. So it's very difficult to make a public health case, but it has been very effective politically. You know, increasing sentences and putting more people in jail and sending soldiers into Colombia or wherever it is. So it's worked as a political program. It hasn't worked as a public health program because it never really was one. It's always been a form of an expression of political dominance over certain populations. I mean, the war on drugs as a political narrative, it's very much a threat-based narrative. So we have these twin threats, both of the drugs themselves that will poison and kill and addict and toxify your body and destroy your family and your community and your children and so on. But we also have the parallel threat of drug markets, so organized crime and gangsters and sinister dealers and Pablo Escobar and the guy hanging out outside the school gates trying to sell addictive drugs to your children. So we have this very threat-based narrative. And it's kind of, in many ways, I think it's ironic that the response to the threat of drugs themselves has actually created the threat from organized crime, because it's, you know, organized crime are only involved in drug markets because of prohibition against the drugs. So it's a sort of self-reinforcing circle of circular logic that is self-justifying, because prohibition it makes drugs more dangerous than they already are. I mean, all drug use obviously involves risks, but prohibition increases those risks. So prohibition increases the dangers and justifies itself by pointing to these dangers. You know, you can look at all the tens of thousands of people dying from fentanyl every year now in the US, but fentanyl is a creation of the war on drugs. You know, if opium or even heroin had been available in some regulated, responsibly regulated form, people would never have moved to fentanyl in the first place. You know, it's the economic incentives of a completely unregulated illegal market that have driven the market towards these more potent, dangerous, but profitable drugs. And it's the same thing with, you can see it with coca as well. You know, crack was created by the economic incentives of an illegal market. It wasn't that people were going, oh, if only we had a smokable version of cocaine. That people weren't crying out for that. There was no demand for it. It was pushed onto the people by, the economic dynamics of an unregulated, supply and demand within an unregulated market. The key argument for the war on drugs is that drugs are bad and we will fight them. I mean, if you were going to make it as simple as possible, that is the argument for prohibition and the war on drugs. And, you can just look at the name, a war on drugs. It's very much framed as a war against a threat. And the threat is drug. And the war against that, it's like you're having a war against an invading army of zombies or aliens or Nazis or something. It's that you hype up the threat and then you declare war against it. And in the context of a war, you move outside of the norms of normal public health and social policy. You don't need evidence of effectiveness. And of course, with the war on drugs, there is no evidence of effectiveness because it's been incredibly ineffective. What you need is, it's almost like a moral binary. It's a war against evil. I mean, the term evil is actually used in the single convention on drugs. We will combat this evil. And it's the only use of the word evil in any UN convention. Drugs are evil and we must combat them. So the very foundational legal documents of the global of the war on drugs as a global enterprise are framed in this very kind of almost biblical language, a war against evil. And they literally say that, so it has this sort of intrinsic righteousness to it, which means that you don't need evidence, you don't need science, you don't need to make any arguments. We are fighting evil. The argument is obviously made that if we fight the war on drugs, we can win. We will create a drug-free society. So the idea of a drug-free communities or drug-free society or a drug-free world at the UN level, that is language that's used. Drug-free societies is a theme that runs through all prohibitionist discourse as the vision. Now, the fact that we're getting further and further away from a drug-free society because drug use is going up and has been for the entire time of prohibition, no one seems to register that. The fact that it's a complete failure on its own terms doesn't register because it's a righteous crusade. It's a war against evil, and you don't need evidence in that context. But the idea of the war on drugs is that that punishing users will deter use, so people will be deterred from using drugs, and that enforcement against supply will prevent supply of drugs to the point where they disappear. And finally we create a drug-free society. Now, obviously, that has no bearing on reality at all. Nothing to do with reality, because that clearly hasn't happened. We've had the war on drugs now for generations, going all the way back to Nixon, or go back further to 1961 and the Single Convention, or go back further to the Opium Conventions in the 1920s. And during that time, drug use has been increasing. So for a policy that's very specifically aiming to reduce use and reduce drug markets and create a drug-free society, it has literally every single year of its existence for more than a century done the exact opposite. So it's an extraordinary failure. Well, one of the problems with unregulated drugs is that they, that you increase the risks. So all drug use involves risk of some sort. It may be a tiny, a negligible risk, say like drinking a cup of coffee or chewing coca leaf, like doing party drugs, occasionally, like having a line of cocaine or an ecstasy pill at a birthday party or New Year or festival or something, through to very extreme risk. So if you're smoking crack or injecting heroin or doing both at the same time, or you're using drugs every day in a sort of compulsive, intense way, which is extremely high risk. If you're injecting heroin every day and it's street heroin that may be contaminated or adulterated, it's very risky. But even something like heroin, you look at someone who's using street heroin with dirty needles that they're sharing with people in the streets in unhygienic spaces, and they are committing crimes to raise money to buy that heroin from a drug dealing network that stems all the way back to Afghanistan. If you compare that individual and all the harms that they're exposing themselves to and all the harms that they're perpetuating through support of the illegal market and the crimes they're committing to get the money to buy those drugs, if you compare them to someone who is prescribed heroin by a doctor in a clinic, and they drop in every day and they inject in with clean needles in a supervised hygienic space, with a nurse present, and they're using pharmaceutical heroin, they're completely different. They're completely different. The person using prescribed heroin is never going to die of an overdose, because if they did overdose, there would be someone there to reverse it. They're never going to get infections or bloodborne disease transmission because they're using clean needles. They're not involved in any crime to buy the drugs because they're prescribed them, and they're not supporting any kind of criminal networks because the drug is a legal drug like everything else you see in a pharmacy. And because it exists within this unregulated space, you create economic incentives for criminal entrepreneurs to do that. Why would you bother importing 50 kilograms of heroin when you can import 1 kilogram of fentanyl, or you can import a matchbox of carfentanil? It's just much easier to transport. So it makes if you don't care about people dying, if you're a rational economic actor, it makes perfect sense to sell fentanyl instead of heroin. Why would you? Because it's just much easier to transport. It's easier to manufacture. You don't have to make it from poppies in Afghanistan or Colombia or somewhere. You can just make it in a laboratory. It's like Breaking Bad, and then you can sell it and make loads of money. And you don't care whether people are overdosing or not because you're making so much money. And it also means that the market tilts towards more potent preparations like fentanyl or like crack. You can't buy smoked opium on the streets of a US city, but you can get fentanyl. You can't buy coca leaf, but you can get crack. And it's like going into a bar and only being able to buy vodka or whiskey instead of just I want a light beer, I just want a beer. And they go, well, no, we're only serving overproof rum here. It makes no sense at all from a health point of view. Yeah, in every way, prohibition and illegal supply increases the risk associated with drugs, and it doesn't stop people using them. The coca plant was criminalized globally in 1961 under the Single Convention on Drugs. And the focus of that prohibition was essentially on cocaine, but the coca plant was also criminalized. Now, that hasn't been the case with every drug that's been criminalized under the UN. So, for example, mescaline or psilocybin or DMT, which are found naturally in various plants and products like ayahuasca and peyote cactus, or magic mushrooms. The plants in those cases weren't criminalized. Only psilocybin was criminalized under the treaties, but not magic mushrooms themselves. But for various historic reasons, cannabis, opium, poppies, and coca were criminalized as the plants themselves were criminalized. And those discussions that led to that criminalization took place without the participation of the communities who have used coca traditionally for many centuries, many millennia. So they weren't involved in those discussions. And so I think a huge kind of colonial injustice was done to those people because they weren't part of the discussions that led to the criminalization of their traditional practices. So there was a fundamental injustice, a colonial injustice. It was imposed on them, and their traditional practices were effectively criminalized. And all of the countries where traditional coca use takes place incorporated those laws, incorporated those UN laws into their domestic laws as well. So they were criminalized twice, at domestic level and under international law. And I think we can see that now with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which makes it very clear that such traditional practices, including psychoactive plants, should not be criminalized, and they should be, in fact, protected. So you now have a kind of strange situation where you have one UN mechanism in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that seems to be in direct contradiction another UN mechanism, which is the UN drug treaties, which criminalize those practice that the declaration seeks to protect. So there's a real contradiction there. In terms of the practical impacts of that, I think a lot of indigenous practices and a lot of indigenous communities have not just been criminalized, and many people have been arrested and literally been harmed personally, but they'll have been arrested and incarcerated. But they've been stigmatized as well. They've been unfairly associated with all the negative sort of popular culture around cocaine, which had nothing to do with them. Indigenous communities who use coca did not use cocaine. It wasn't part of their culture in any way. It was a modern invention of the global north. And there have been other terrible effects on them in terms of the impacts of the war on drugs, specifically the war on cocaine, specifically eradication attempts. So you've seen militarization of eradication against these populations and against their ancestral homelands, with things like aerial spraying using glyphosate that has destroyed the environment, manual eradication of coca crops, and that has led to and violence. Militarized policing. And when these communities have tried to defend themselves, they've often been attacked and murdered. So the effects have been appalling for something that they had nothing to do with, which is the cocaine market in the global north. Effectively, I mean, it's quite extraordinary, and I think it's only really now that that discourse and that fundamental injustice is beginning to diffuse into the mainstream political narrative. I think it's very welcome, albeit very late, but we are beginning to see real pushback against that fundamental injustice that is being highlighted. The stories are being told, and people are saying something needs to change now. You're seeing this in mainstream media. You're seeing it at the United Nations. You're seeing it within civil society. So something is changing, but it needed to, because there was a profound injustice has been done to these communities who have used coca leaf traditionally. I think most people who use cocaine in Europe or North America, which are the two biggest markets. I mean, there are other markets. There are smaller markets in Asia. There's a big market in Brazil, for example. But the main markets for cocaine are in North America and Europe. And I think people, when they buy a little packet of white powder, they have very little understanding or association with the supply chain that's led to them having this white powder that they stick up their nose. They don't really associate it with the fact that there may be farmers in remote parts of the Andes growing small-scale plots of coca leaf that then get sold into a much bigger network of organized crime groups who will refine and produce it into coca paste. It's then transported, sometimes through the Caribbean, sometimes through maybe through West Africa, places like Guinea-Bissau, before it finally through middlemen and through other organized crime networks, before it reaches the street dealers who deliver it to the parties and the people taking cocaine for pleasure. In the global north, there's incredibly little awareness of that. The idea that this thing that you're taking was produced on the other side of the world and has been refined from a plant that's been grown in the beautiful mountains of the Andes. People just don't really think about that. But for each part of that supply chain, it can have profound effects on the social and economic development of those communities and those entire regions. There can be impacts on governance, on corruption, on public health, on violence, on policing. It has profound effects along the entire supply chain, but they are all to do with the fact that it's illegal. I mean, one of the things I always think is interesting to point out to people is that there is also an entirely legal cocaine production supply chain for cocaine for medical use. Now, it's quite small. It's only about 700 kilograms of legal cocaine is produced every year for medical use. And a lot of it, weirdly, comes to the UK. It's used as a local anesthetic and vasoconstrictor in ENT surgery, eye, nose, and throat surgery. So cocaine is a medical product. It's a licensed medicine. And it's the same. It's the same, essentially the same. There is coca leaf is grown in Peru, I believe. It's imported by a government authorized company. It's flown to the US by the DEA. It's processed by a pharmaceutical company in the US, I think in Louisiana. The cocaine is extracted and sold to the medical market, and the decocainized coca leaf is sold to the Coca-Cola company to make Coca-Cola, the fizzy, sugary, tooth-rotting drink that's popular. And the clue is in the name, Coca-Cola, because it still contains coca leaf. It just doesn't contain cocaine anymore because the cocaine has been extracted and sold to the UK. So but the interesting thing about that legal cocaine market is that there's no crime, there's no violence, there's no militarized policing, there's no environmental damage, there's no crop spraying, there's no none of the problems that we associate with illegal cocaine are associated with that product, because it's essentially like any other plant-based pharmaceutical extract industry. It's legal, it's regulated throughout the entire supply chain. That exists already. It's not like you have to invent it or imagine it. There is one already, and it's not associated with any of those problems. And I think that's genuinely interesting. And I think that's part of what's inspired work that Transform and myself have done, looking at options for legally regulated cocaine markets, because we already have one. And I'm kind of like, well, you've got these two options here. It seems to make sense that you take the one that's not associated with crime and chaos and violence and corruption and environmental destruction and death. Periodically in the UK, we get these sort of spasms of media hysteria around cocaine, and it's often associated with a celebrity story. So a celebrity is associated with cocaine. There was a big media sting on Kate Moss, the supermodel, where she was filmed allegedly taking cocaine, and it became a big deal. Then Amy Winehouse, was associated with cocaine, and then various other celebrities. And whether each time you get one of these things happens, or there's some cocaine market related violence, or there'll be a big seizure of several tons of cocaine at a port or something. And then periodically you get these sort of spasms of political attention on the cocaine industry. In the UK, the debate around cocaine is very unprogressed. It's very retrograde. It's very backward looking. It's very much caught up in very traditional kind of established war on drugs narratives. Cocaine is bad. It's addictive. The cocaine market is violent. It's cartels. We must fight it. We need to, and politicians will do the classic things of saying, we need more policing. We need to arrest more people. We need to increase the sentences for drug dealers. We need to throw them in prison and throw away the key. And we need to crack down on secure our borders. There's often a lot about securing our borders, as if that is possible. I mean, clearly it's completely impossible to secure the borders of the UK, which is 50,000 miles of borders of the UK. The idea that you can stop cocaine coming in is clearly ridiculous. But politicians keep on saying these things. So in the same, we've heard it in the US, for example, for decades and decades, that we need to secure the southern border with Mexico to stop drugs coming in. Like and it reached its kind of the zenith of idiocy under Trump, where he said we're going to build a wall to stop drugs coming in. And of course the drugs are very much associated with the demonization of drugs is very much associated with the demonization of foreigners and xenophobic narratives, anti-immigration narratives, dirty foreigners bringing their dirty drugs, and they're all criminals and they're all rapists and murderers and drug dealers. And so there's a deeply unpleasant, racist, xenophobic narrative. Anti-immigration narratives have been very much mixed in with anti-drug narratives and classic kind of war on drugs, demonization of drugs and people who use drugs. And that's not just restricted to the US. It's very much part of the UK narratives as well. We are within Europe. We're quite a xenophobic country. We've seen with the whole Brexit debate, which was very framed around anti-immigration narratives and anti-European narratives, and it was all kind of horrible, distasteful, racist narratives, and drugs often gets drawn into that. So the association of alien drugs with illegal aliens. Very commonly, cocaine narratives are associated with xenophobic narratives and anti-immigration posturing and politics. It's all very unpleasant and distasteful, and also, total bullshit from a kind of in terms of it has no bearing on reality. Most people who use cocaine and most people who sell cocaine are not illegal immigrants. But there has been this interesting narrative within the UK about a political where it's sort of okay to criticize middle class drug users, because you can't really criticize working class people who use cocaine, obviously use cocaine as well. I mean, one of the interesting realities of cocaine use in the UK is that over the last 20 years, cocaine, particularly the last sort of 10 years, cocaine has got a lot cheaper and a lot purer. So it's effectively got a lot better. From a consumer perspective, it's a lot better. So, the percentage purity was down to around 20% 10, 12 years ago. You would quite often, people would be buying cocaine, it would be 10 or 20% pure. So 80%, rubbish. Whereas today, routinely, cocaine will be over 70% pure, but it's the same price. So effectively, it's become a much cheaper and more attractive product. And because of that, cocaine use, significantly because of that, cocaine use has been rising. It's also become quite democratized. So what used to be a much more exclusive, privileged drug of kind of richer people has kind of percolated across society. So it's much more widely used, and it's kind of used routinely down the pub. People go and have a beer, and then they'll go to the toilets and have a line of Coke. And it's not a sort of exclusive thing that you only use at sort of shishi cocktail parties. And there's been some really interesting changes in the cocaine market, because when cocaine was its popularity was waning, cocaine use was going down. This was about 10 years ago. I think there was some new actors, some new organized crime actors entered the market, and they basically figured out that they could cut out the middleman. I think these were sort of Eastern European organized crime groups who were already established in the UK but weren't operating in the cocaine space. They forged direct links with some of the Latin American cocaine producers. So they didn't go through sort of transitional organized crime groups. They formed direct groups, and they were importing directly from Colombia, for example. And they worked out that they could sell much higher quality cocaine, not 10 or 20%, but 70 or 80% for the same price. And they could still make loads and loads of money, because it was still made economic sense. Even if you sold it uncut, you would still make an enormous profit, because obviously producing a gram of cocaine in Colombia costs about $1, and then you can sell it for $70-$80 in global north markets. You're making an enormous markup, unbelievable profit. So that happened about 10 years ago, and the market transformed within a matter of a year or two, at which point cocaine started to become much, much more popular, and its popularity has continued to rise. And we've seen things like cocaine being used at football matches openly, which never used to happen. Football matches always used to be about drinking. So you can see how it spreads. It isn't just kind of, Mick Jagger and Elton John at some glamorous party drinking cocktails and doing, neither of them are doing cocaine anymore, but they both talked about their use in the past, by the way. Patterns of cocaine use and the nature of cocaine markets have changed quite dramatically in the UK. And and during that time, it's always been illegal. Cocaine use has been going up for the last 10 years. It's been illegal the whole time. They keep making seizures, and every time there's a seizure, the police come out and the politicians come out and go, look, we've seized all this drugs and we're winning the war on drugs, and we're preventing these drugs from reaching the streets. And of course, it's having no impact at all. It was a couple of months ago, there was the biggest cocaine seizure, I think, ever in the UK. I think 6 tons was confiscated, was seized in Southampton, and it had no impact at all on availability of cocaine, price of cocaine, use of cocaine. The cocaine debate, it is maybe evolving. I mean, I look at the debate around cannabis, and I think, well, 10 years ago, nowhere in the world had legalized and regulated cannabis, and cannabis reform, it was kind of quite stalled. But now you've got 500 million people live in legal cannabis jurisdictions, and that's only taken a few years for that progress to happen. I feel like the debate around cocaine is just beginning to open up. I think it's a much harder argument to make for legally regulated cocaine because it's a much more dangerous drug than cannabis. But that debate is beginning. There are proposals in the city of Bern, which is the capital of Switzerland, to have a trial of legally regulated cocaine for non-medical use. There was a big conference in Amsterdam, hosted by the city of Amsterdam and the mayor of Amsterdam just this year, where mayors from all over the world, from Bogota and Milan and Prague and Bern and other countries, all came to Amsterdam, and they were discussing, how do we move forward with a legally regulated market for cocaine? Not because they love cocaine or they want encouraging people to use cocaine. They were just saying cocaine is a reality in our cities already, and by making it illegal, all we do is fuel health harms and organized crime groups. So we need to begin a discussion. It's moving from the margins into the mainstream. You see, there was a big article in The Economist magazine around legalizing cocaine. So that debate is beginning, but we have to be honest, it's still some time away, I think, before we have meaningful change on that front. But we are already seeing some progress with the coca leaf. In Bolivia, they now have a legally regulated coca leaf market. There seems to be some progress in the debate in other areas of the Andes, in Peru and Argentina and Colombia. There are some discussions going on. I think we're seeing progress with a regional coca market. These things can change, and those conversations have to begin somewhere, and those pathways have to begin. But there are a lot of difficult questions. How you regulate cocaine, or how you regulate coca leaf, or how you regulate an array of different coca or cocaine products, raises a lot of difficult questions, and there's a lot we don't know, and we don't have that kind of experience with regulating stimulants that we have with alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. I think there's one thing that I think it's going to be important to think about, that in the same way we've seen the opioid market shift increasingly towards away from plant-based opioids that are based on poppy and opium and morphine and heroin, towards synthetic opioids, whether it's medicalized ones like methadone and buprenorphine, hydromorphone, or whether it's synthetic opioids like nitazines and fentanyls. The market is moving from plant-based to synthetic. And I think in some ways we've seen that with cannabis, with synthetic cannabinoid drugs, and now with these hemp-derived semi-synthetic drugs like Delta-8 and HHC. I think the era of plant-based drugs maybe sort of in its twilight years. It's the sunset years of plant-based drugs as mass market consumer products, certainly within the illegal market. And I think we have to think it may happen with coca and cocaine as well. Either synthetic stimulants that can deliver similar effects to cocaine will push cocaine out, whether it's amphetamines or synthetic cathinone drugs like methadone, or other drugs that will be developed, because there are hundreds now of novel synthetic stimulants emerging every week. But I think it's also realistic to think someone may find a way to manufacture cocaine synthetically that doesn't involve the coca plant at all. And people are already trying to do that. They may find a way to use yeast to produce genetically modified yeast to produce cocaine. We can already do that with certain drugs, with certain opioids. We can produce them using genetically modified yeast. And if someone figures out a way to do that, and it probably won't be a university, it'll probably be an organized crime group. If they find out a way to produce cheaply, in the same way that we produce MDMA or these other synthetic drugs, to produce cocaine synthetically, the entire cocaine supply chain changes overnight. So there will the coca plant and production in Latin America or elsewhere in Central America just stops literally overnight. That entire market collapses, and I think there are real implications of that, development implications, economic, political, cultural implications to that. And it could be very, very sudden. And it could happen in a matter of, if someone invents a way of doing that, it could happen in a couple of years. The entire cocaine pipeline collapses completely, and millions of people who are engaged in that, most of whom are not like Pablo Escobar, most of whom are marginalized people trying to, operating within the illegal market as a form of economic survival, they are going to be cut off from, one of the few sources of income that they have. And I think it's something that we need to be thinking about and planning for, because I can talk about, well, legal cocaine, and wouldn't it be nice if we can get coca leaf, from legal production and unions and, environmentally sound and so on, and make cocaine and sell it. And maybe we could have nice coca leaf products that we could sell in the global north, that would be safer than cocaine powder, and all of this stuff that we've written about and talked about and proposed, and other people are talking about in Colombia and elsewhere. But I think it's very possible that organized crime groups could find a way to make cocaine synthetically very easily and cheaply. And I think the game completely changes, because Latin America just won't be part of it anymore, or it would shrink by 95% almost overnight. I mean, a traditional coca leaf production for traditional use in, what is it, 1% of the total, maybe 5%? It's a tiny fraction. Everything else is gone, because it would be, the Albanian or the Turkish or the French or the UK organized crime groups, they would just make it over here. Why would the Colombians that gone out? Is that I think there's a really important dimension of the environmental sustainability discussion associated with illegal drug production, which I don't think is very well explored, and certainly hasn't been a part of the environmental discourse in high-level forums or in the mainstream public and political discourse around environmental sustainability. People are quite familiar with the idea that if we use illegal cocaine, that there are organized crime groups and illegal production, and they're cutting down rainforests to grow this cocaine. And we hear that quite a lot in the UK, actually. People say, look, every time you do a line of cocaine, that you're cutting down rainforests and destroying the environment. And there is some truth in that. There is some truth in that. Now, I think you can make an argument that an enforcement and eradication magnifies that negative impact, because obviously every time you eradicate one area of cocaine, more forest will be cut down to grow farm cocaine somewhere else. So enforcement is not stopping that it's actually magnifying those environmental harms. But I think really the actual area of cocaine under cultivation is actually quite small. The cocaine market actually is quite small. I mean, it's worth maybe 100 billion or 150 billion dollars a year. It depends on whose estimates you go by. Maybe more than that, maybe 200 billion dollars a year. But actually, it's, in terms of area, it's really small. It's only about 700 tons of cocaine is consumed a year. And actually, to produce 700 tons of cocaine, you can do that in an area, in a square that has 15-mile sides. It's actually quite a small area. That tiny market is only worth that 100 or 200 billion a year because of prohibition inflating the costs of the price of cocaine. And so it's not the fact the coca growing itself which is damaging the environment. The problem is that the profits from that are so huge those profits are being laundered and recycled through a whole array of environmental damaging industries, such as deforestation for ranching, such as illegal mining, such as illegal logging, such as the trade in rare wildlife products. So these enormously harmful industries are being perpetuated by illegal drug profits, often using the same infrastructure in terms of roads cutting into the rainforests and so on. And of course, all of this is happening in the most environmentally sensitive areas of the world, which is the tropics, which are literally the lungs of the world and have a profound impact on climate change and carbon emissions. And even worse than that, so you have these magnifying effects. You have the coca production itself, you have eradication making that worse, you have the profits from that coca production being invested in magnifying by 100-fold through all these awful harmful industries that are related to deforestation, like logging and ranching and so on, and illegal mining. But worst of all is the corruption of civic institutions by the cartels and illegal drug money. That it corrupts the police, it corrupts the judiciary, it corrupts the political process, to the extent that there are entire regions, and in some cases entire countries, if you look at places that are being destabilized, like Ecuador, that are being torn apart and destabilized to the point by the cartels and by illegal drug money, to the extent that governance that could put in place climate mitigation, climate justice, effective environmental damage mitigation is impossible. And the more remote regions that we're talking about are also the regions that are so important to environmental mitigations. I don't think we can meet the climate goals, that the sustainable development goals, while the war on drugs is being fought. And of course, the only way to the answer to this is to legalize and regulate cocaine. It literally is the only answer. But that's such a terrifying thought for mainstream political discourse that the mainstream environmental movement is just terrified to even go near that. But they need to acknowledge, they need to wake up. And I just think it's a huge issue that the environmental movement is completely ignoring. It's not on the radar at all, or only beginning to just be. So I think this is one real area for drug policy reform people and for environmental people and people working in sustainable development. They have to think about this. Drugs is a development issue. It is an environmental issue. And we can't realize the sustainable development goals unless we end the war on drugs.